On the last morning of April in 1993, the apricot trees on the Ashcroft place stood in full bloom. 14 acres of pale pink and white blossoms spread across a low ridge above Pine Hollow, a small, unincorporated crossroads in Oakridge County that most maps did not bother to name. Eleanor Ashcroft,
See that tower?
known to
It
everyone
keeps
in the
frost
county
off your
simply as
crops.
Nell,
How's it work?
walked the rows
It
that morning
circulates
the way
warm
she
air.
walked them every morning that time of year, slow and watchful, because she understood something that newer growers in the county sometimes forgot, which was that an apricot blossom was not a flower so much as it was a promise, and a promise that could be broken by a single bad night. The orchard had been planted more than 4 decades earlier by her father-in-law, Silas Ashcroft, on land he bought cheap after coming home from the war, land nobody else wanted because it sat low against a creek, and everyone said fruit trees would freeze there before they ever bore. Silas planted them anyway, apricots instead of the apples and pears that filled the rest of the county, because he had grown up around stone fruit in another state, and because he believed, as he used to tell his son Walter, that a man who understood frost could grow anything anywhere. Nell had married into that belief before she understood what it meant. She was 19 when she came to Pine Hollow as Walter's bride, a town girl who had never spent a night worrying about a thermometer, and it was not her husband who first taught her to read the cold, but an old neighbor named Cyrus Pruitt, a widower himself who had farmed the next section over since before the war, and who took a liking to the quiet, curious young woman who kept asking him questions instead of laughing at his stories. Cyrus was gone 11 years now, but Nell still heard his voice some nights when the wind dropped and the sky went clear and hard, because a clear, hard sky in springtime, Cyrus used to say, was the most dangerous sky there was. Walter had died 3 years before this story begins, and since then Nell had run the orchard alone, with help hired only at harvest, and the county had mostly stopped waiting for her to give up and sell. What the county had not stopped doing was talking about her, and in the last week of April that talk had a fresh subject, because the National Weather Service Office 2 counties over had issued an advisory that a hard freeze was expected to settle over the region for 2 consecutive nights at the very end of the month, with temperatures forecast to fall into the upper 20s, right in the middle of full bloom for every stone fruit orchard in Oakridge County. For an apple grower, a freeze like that was a worry. For an apricot grower, it was closer to a catastrophe, because apricots bloomed earliest of all the orchard fruits, and their blossoms could not tolerate more than an hour or two below about 28 degrees before the delicate reproductive parts inside them died, taking the whole year's crop with them even though the tree itself would live on unharmed. Word of the coming freeze brought a traveling equipment man named Roy Delacroix into the county that same week, driving a truck loaded with brochures for propane-fired orchard heaters and portable wind machines, machinery that could push warmer air down from higher layers and keep an orchard's temperature a few critical degrees above the danger line. Roy had sold 2 rigs already to growers on the county line and was making his way down toward Pine Hollow when he stopped at the Ashcroft place, less because he expected to sell her anything and more because everyone he had spoken to that week had mentioned her, usually with a laugh, as the widow who still ran her orchard the old way. He found Nell in the barn, going through a stack of squat metal pots that had sat under a tarp since Silas Ashcroft's time, cleaning out the burners with a wire brush and checking the little draft caps on top. Roy asked her, not unkindly, whether she understood what was coming for her blossoms in 2 nights' time, and Nell told him that she did understand, better than he thought, and that the pots he was looking at were smudge pots, low-burning orchard heaters that had kept this exact ground planted in fruit since before either of them was born. Roy laughed and said that smudge pots were something his own grandfather had used and that the whole county had moved past them for good reason, because a modern wind machine could cover 40 acres from one tower while her old pots would need to be lit and tended by hand across the whole orchard, all night, twice in a row. Nell answered that she had done exactly that more nights than he had been alive, and that she intended to do it again, and Roy, still smiling, said that was her business, though he did not think much of her chances. He drove off toward Briar Creek to call on David Reese and the other growers there, and within a day the story of the widow lighting old smudge pots by hand while her neighbors rented proper machinery had made its way around every kitchen table and Grange Hall in that end of the county, most people telling it as a joke, a few telling it as something closer to admiration, though not many of the second kind said so out loud. What none of them in town understood And what Nell had never bothered explaining because it took longer to explain than most conversations allowed, was that the orchard's low ground, the very ground everyone had once said would doom Silas Ashcroft's trees, was also the reason a hand-tended smudge fire could work here when it might fail somewhere flatter. Cyrus Pruitt had taught her, walking these same rows with her on cold, clear evenings when Walter was still a young man and she was newly married, that cold air behaved like water. It did not spread out evenly across a piece of land, he told her. It drained downhill and pooled in the low places the same way rain did, which meant that on a still, clear, frost-prone night the coldest air in the whole county would settle first and deepest in exactly the low swale where the Ashcroft orchard sat, along the line closest to the creek, while the higher rows near the barn stayed several degrees warmer simply because the cold had somewhere lower to go. A wind machine worked by pulling down warmer air that had risen above the coldest layer near the ground, and that could be effective on open, gently sloping ground. But here in this particular bowl of land the coldest air did not rise into a warmer inversion layer the way it did. Elsewhere, it collected and stayed. What this ground needed, Cyrus had always said, was heat put directly into the coldest air where it sat, which was precisely what a properly placed smudge fire did, warming the immediate air around the blossoms by a few degrees, and, just as importantly, laying down a thin blanket of smoke that slowed the loss of the ground's stored daytime heat back up into the clear night sky. He had shown her, decades earlier, exactly where along the rows the cold pooled worst, marking it not with any instrument, but by walking the orchard at 4 in the morning on cold nights with a simple outdoor thermometer and noting where the mercury dropped first and fell lowest. And Nell had kept his hand-drawn map of those cold pockets folded inside an old seed catalog in the kitchen drawer for 11 years. In the 2 days before the freeze was due, Nell readied 19 smudge pots, filling each with a low grade of heating oil, checking every wick and draft cap, and setting them out not evenly across the orchard but concentrated most heavily along the 2 lowest rows nearest the creek, with a lighter scattering up toward the higher ground near the barn, where Cyrus's old readings had always shown the air staying a few degrees kinder. She set 4 outdoor thermometers at different points along the slope, just as Cyrus had taught her, so that she would not have to guess where the trouble was starting but could see it for herself as the night went on. On the first night of the freeze, the sky cleared completely by 9 o'clock, the wind died to nothing, and Nell was out among the trees by 10 with a lantern and a box of matches, lighting the pots along the lowest row first. By 1 in the morning the thermometer at the creek line read 28 degrees, the threshold Cyrus had always warned her about, and she began lighting the second tier of pots, moving row to row in the dark, feeling the small stinging warmth of each fire against her hands as she worked. Up at David Reese's orchard that same night, and at 2 others along the county road, the new propane wind machines roared to life on schedule, and for a while it looked as though the modern equipment would carry the county through without incident. But wind machines depended on there being a warmer layer of air above the cold layer to pull down, and on ground that was flatter and more open than Nell's, that assumption mostly held. What none of the machine owners had accounted for was that keeping a propane heater running at full output for 2 full nights in a row cost far more fuel than any of them had budgeted, since most growers, following Roy's own recommendation, had ordered propane for 1 hard night, not 2. By the second night, with the forecast calling for an even harder freeze near 26 degrees, at least one neighbor found his tank running low well before dawn and had no fuel delivery arranged until the following afternoon, leaving several rows of his own orchard essentially unprotected for the coldest hours of the night. Nell had no such shortage to worry about, because oil for 19 small pots cost only a fraction of what propane for a wind machine cost, but she paid for that economy in a different currency, which was her own body, awake and moving through both nights, checking her 4 thermometers by lantern light every half hour, relighting pots that burned low, and standing for long stretches at the 2 lowest rows because that was where Cyrus's map told her the fight would be won or lost. Toward 4 in the morning on the second night, the coldest hour of the whole freeze, the thermometer at the creek line dropped to 25 degrees in the open air just beyond her last row of pots, close enough to the edge of her protected ground that she stood there for nearly an hour adding a 20th pot she had kept in reserve, moving it between the 2 rows she judged most at risk, trusting her own eyes and Cyrus's old instructions over anything a company brochure might have told her. By the time the sky began to lighten, both nights of the freeze were behind her, and Oakridge County Extension Agent Doris Fenwick, who had spent the morning driving from orchard to orchard on behalf of the Prairie Star Growers Cooperative to assess bloom survival before the co-op set its early crop estimates, arrived at the Ashcroft place a little after 9, walking the rows with Nell, cutting open a sample of blossoms here and there the way she did at every stop that morning. Doris found that along the 2 lowest rows nearest the creek, the rows that had carried the heaviest concentration of pots, better than 9 in every 10 blossoms, showed the healthy green center that meant the fruit inside had survived the freeze. Further up the slope, where Nell had spread her remaining pots more thinly because Cyrus's readings had always shown that ground running a little warmer on its own, the survival rate was still good, though not quite as high. And at the very top corner of the orchard, near the fence line by the road, where Nell had judged the risk low enough not to place a pot at all, Doris found a small patch of blossoms that had blackened and died in the second, harder night, a reminder that even a well-placed fire could not stretch to cover every foot of ground, and that Nell herself had never claimed it could. Down at David Reese's place, and at the 2 other orchards running propane machines, Doris found the results more uneven, strong survival in the rows nearest the machines, but real losses in the rows farthest from them, and in the section that had run short of fuel on the second night, so that by mid-morning it was already clear around the co-op that the widow's smudge pots, for all the laughing that had gone on about them the week before, had come through the freeze at least as well as anyone's. Modern equipment, and in the lowest, coldest ground, better. Roy Delacroix drove back through Pine Hollow 2 days later, on his way out of the county, and stopped at the Ashcroft place mostly out of curiosity rather than business. He walked the rows with Nell in the ordinary daylight this time, and when he asked how she had known so precisely where to put the pots and where to leave the ground uncovered, she told him about Cyrus Pruitt and his old habit of walking these same rows before dawn with nothing but a thermometer, and about the folded map that had sat in her kitchen drawer for 11 years, and she explained to him, the way Cyrus had once explained it to her, that cold air moved and settled and pooled the same way water did, and that a person who wanted to fight it well had to understand the shape of their own ground before they understood anything about equipment. Roy admitted that in all his years selling frost machines, nobody had ever put it to him quite that way, and he left that afternoon without trying to sell her anything, and without laughing. Later that summer, when the co-op finally tallied the season's apricot numbers for that end of the county, Nell's orchard came in among the higher yields on the list, not because her method was flawless, since the county extension records that year did note some blossom loss in her uncovered fence line corner, and did note as well that hand-tended smudge fires demanded far more of a grower's own labor and sleep than propane equipment did, but because the low, simple, decades-old method, placed with real knowledge of the particular ground it was protecting, had done what it needed to do on the 2 nights that mattered most. What kept the Ashcroft orchard alive that spring was not some secret cure for frost, and it was not a rejection of modern machinery for its own sake, since Cyrus Pruitt himself had never claimed that new equipment was worthless, only that no piece of equipment could replace an understanding of one's own land. Orchard heating with low-burning smudge fires, and the older, related practice of studying how cold air drains and pools across uneven ground before deciding where to place protection, had been part of American fruit growing since long before propane wind machines existed, developed by growers across the country who learned, often the hard way, that a freeze rarely struck a piece of land evenly, and that the coldest air on a still, clear night nearly always settled first in the lowest ground. The heat from a properly tended smudge fire warmed the immediate air around the blossoms by only a few degrees, and the thin layer of smoke it produced slowed the rate at which the day's stored warmth escaped back into a clear night sky. And together those few degrees were often exactly the margin of blossom needed to survive until sunrise. It was not a method without limits. It demanded fuel, constant attention through the coldest hours, and above all a grower's own careful, patient reading of exactly where on their land the danger was worst, which was the same quiet, unglamorous kind of knowledge that had kept the Ashcroft orchard blooming on ground everyone once said was too low and too cold to plant at all.